He was just a poor orphan, a boy with... Imagine being a child and losing both of your parents before you even finish school. Imagine standing at their graveside, not knowing what tomorrow will bring, with no money, no security, and no family to guide you. For most people, this would be the end of hope. But for Hans Wilsdorf, this tragedy became the beginning of a story that would one day change the way the world tells time. This is not just the story of Rolex, the world's most famous watch brand. It is the story of a poor orphan who had nothing, and yet built an empire of precision, luxury, and legacy. Hans Wilsdorf was born in 1881 in the quiet town of Kulmbach, Germany. His childhood, however, was far from quiet. At just 12 years old, he suffered a devastating blow. Both of his parents died within a short span of time. Orphaned, he and his siblings were forced to move in with relatives. But life with relatives was not a comfortable childhood. It was survival. Hans learned to rely only on himself, to be disciplined, and to dream beyond the limits of his circumstances. As a teenager, he discovered a fascination with precision instruments. Numbers, mechanics, and the delicate ticking of watch gears drew him in. Unlike other children who dreamed of adventure or wealth, Hans dreamed of accuracy. He wanted to create something that measured life itself, time. In his late teens, Hans moved to Switzerland, the home of the watchmaking industry. He found a job at a watch export company called Kuno Korten, where he worked as an apprentice. Here, something extraordinary happened. Hans was surrounded by finely crafted Swiss watches, not as luxuries, but as everyday business. He learned how watches were made, how they were sold, and more importantly, how global trade worked. He discovered the difference between a good watch and a great one. But there was a problem. At the time, watches were mostly seen as delicate items for the pocket. Unreliable, fragile, and often inaccurate. No one trusted them as serious tools. And wristwatches? Those were seen as delicate ornaments for women, not practical devices for men. Hans looked at this world and thought, what if a watch could be reliable, accurate, and strong enough to be worn on the wrist every day? Hans was not yet a businessman. He had no money, no factory, and no brand. But he had something far more dangerous to the established industry: a vision. He believed wristwatches could be the future. While his colleagues laughed at the idea, Hans worked day and night on the possibility. He imagined a time when soldiers, explorers, and leaders would all wear reliable wristwatches instead of fragile pocket watches. At just 24 years old, in 1905, Hans moved to London. He rented a small office and, together with his brother-in-law, Alfred Davis, founded a company. Their goal was to import Swiss watch movements and put them into elegant cases that could be sold in England. It was a bold step. London was the financial heart of the world, but Hans was still just a poor immigrant with no reputation. He needed a brand name that would be simple, international, and unforgettable. Hans experimented with hundreds of names. They had to be short, easy to pronounce in any language, and look good on a watch face. After endless trials, he came up with one word: Rolex. Why Rolex? According to Hans, he wanted a name that was crisp, easy to remember, and would fit neatly on the dial of a watch. It didn't mean anything, it just sounded like precision. And just like that, the brand was born. At this point, Rolex was just a name, and Hans was just another dreamer. But he was different from the rest. He obsessed over quality and accuracy. He demanded his suppliers produce the most precise movements possible, pushing Swiss watchmakers to higher standards. Then, in 1910, something extraordinary happened. A Rolex watch became the first wristwatch in the world to receive a certificate of chronometric precision from the official watch rating center in Bienne-Sitte, Switzerland. 4 years later, in 1914, the Kew Observatory in England awarded a Rolex wristwatch a Class A precision certificate, the same recognition previously given only to marine chronometers, the highly accurate clocks used in ships for navigation. For the first time in history, a wristwatch was not seen as a fragile toy. It was as accurate as the instruments guiding ships across oceans. Hans had done the impossible. He had turned a poor orphan's dream into reality. But a new challenge was coming. The year was 1914. Europe was about to explode into the First World War. Millions of soldiers were about to enter the trenches, where every second could mean life or death. Pocket watches were useless in battle. Soldiers needed something they could wear on their wrists, something reliable, waterproof, and unbreakable. Hans saw it coming before anyone else. Rolex was about to face its greatest test, but what happened next would change the watch industry forever. The year was 1914. Europe was burning. The First World War had begun, and the old world was collapsing in blood and fire. Millions of men went to the front lines, and with them came a new demand: time. In the trenches, every second mattered. Coordinating artillery, moving troops, launching attacks, all depended on precision. But pocket watches were impractical in the mud, chaos, and danger of war. Soldiers needed something tougher, faster, and easier to carry. They needed a wristwatch. And this was the moment Hans Wilsdorf had been waiting for. Before the war, wristwatches were dismissed as jewelry for women. Real men, it was said, carried pocket watches. But war changed everything. Soldiers began strapping their pocket watches onto leather bands and wearing them on their wrists. Suddenly, practicality defeated tradition. Hans Wilsdorf's belief was finally coming true. The world was ready for wristwatches. But while others rushed to produce cheap models, Hans had something else in mind. He wanted a wristwatch that wasn't just convenient. It had to be the most accurate, durable, and trustworthy timepiece on Earth. This obsession would make Rolex legendary. During the war, business in London grew difficult. High taxes on imports hurt Wilsdorf's company badly, and in 1919, he made a bold move. He relocated Rolex to Geneva, Switzerland, the heart of watchmaking. Here, surrounded by master craftsmen, he could control every aspect of production. But Hans still faced a massive challenge. Wristwatches were fragile. Dust, moisture, and shocks often destroyed them. If he wanted to win the trust of the world, he had to build something indestructible. In 1926, Rolex unveiled a revolutionary creation, the Rolex Oyster. It was the world's first truly waterproof wristwatch. Its case was sealed like an oyster shell, protecting the movement inside from dust and water. But Hans knew that innovation alone wasn't enough. People had to believe in it. So he did something brilliant. In 1927, a young swimmer named Mercedes Gleitze attempted to swim across the English Channel. She strapped a Rolex Oyster to her wrist. For more than 10 hours, the watch was submerged in cold, salty water, and when she emerged, exhausted but triumphant, the watch was still ticking perfectly. The newspapers called it a miracle. Rolex took out full-page ads announcing the feat. Overnight, the brand wasn't just about accuracy, it was about endurance. This story of Hans Wilsdorf is more than just the history of a company. It's a testament to the power of a single idea, fueled by unstoppable determination. From an orphan with nothing to his name, he built a global symbol of excellence. His journey reminds us that tragedy can be a starting point, and that the greatest empires are often built not on money, but on a vision that no one else can see. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story of resilience and innovation, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next one. The Oyster case had made Rolex unstoppable. But its founder, Hans Wilsdorf, wasn't finished. He saw another problem with watches of the day: winding. Back then, you had to manually wind your watch every single day by turning the crown. If you forgot, it stopped. So, in 1931, Rolex unveiled the perpetual movement, the world's first self-winding mechanism with a free rotor. This genius invention used the natural motion of the wearer's wrist to keep the watch wound. No more daily winding, no more forgetting. The watch was now more reliable and convenient than ever. It was another monumental leap. Now, a Rolex wasn't just waterproof, it was automatic. A watch that worked for you, silently and effortlessly. Through the 1930s and 40s, Rolex became the go-to timepiece for explorers, athletes, and soldiers. When Sir Malcolm Campbell shattered world land speed records in his race car, a Rolex was on his wrist. During World War II, British fighter pilots, frustrated with their standard-issue timepieces, bought Rolex watches for their reliability in the cockpit. There's a famous story from that era about captured pilots in German POW camps. Their Rolexes were confiscated, but Hans Wilsdorf, hearing of their plight, personally arranged for replacement watches to be sent to them, free of charge, as soon as the war ended. It was an act of loyalty these men never forgot. Rolex was becoming more than just a brand. It was a symbol of trust, honor, and unbreakable resilience. By this point, Rolex had built a reputation unlike any other. But Hans Wilsdorf knew the journey wasn't over. He understood that luxury brands are built on more than just technology. They need an identity, a sense of prestige, and a powerful vision. While other watchmakers focused on producing as many watches as possible, Hans focused on telling stories. He strategically tied Rolex to the greatest human achievements. Every time someone did something extraordinary, crossed an ocean, climbed a mountain, flew across continents, Hans made sure a Rolex was part of the story. This wasn't luck. It was a masterclass in marketing. Rolex was no longer just keeping time. It was keeping history. By the middle of the 20th century, Rolex had proven itself waterproof, automatic, and incredibly precise. But could it become the world's ultimate symbol of success? Hans Wilsdorf had already turned an orphan's dream into a globally respected company. Now, he set his sights on an even bigger goal: to make Rolex a global icon. What happened next would transform Rolex from a great watch brand into the undisputed king of luxury watches. By the mid-20th century, Rolex was already highly respected for its engineering. But Hans Wilsdorf wanted more. He didn't just want Rolex to be a great watch, he wanted it to be the watch. A symbol recognized instantly across the globe, a mark of achievement, success, and endurance. This was the pivotal moment when Rolex transitioned from being an exceptional tool to an enduring icon. The 1950s were a golden age of exploration. Humanity was pushing its limits, climbing the highest peaks, diving to the deepest oceans, and soaring through the skies. Hans Wilsdorf knew exactly where Rolex belonged, on the wrists of the people making history. In 1953, when Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay became the first men to stand on the summit of Mount Everest, what was on their wrists? Rolex watches. In response, Rolex developed the Explorer model, a watch specifically designed to withstand extreme conditions, forever linking the brand to the conquest of the impossible. That very same year, Rolex released the Submariner, a watch capable of descending 100 meters underwater. It wasn't just for divers, it was a statement that Rolex could go where humans had barely begun to venture. The Submariner quickly became a favorite of explorers, soldiers, and even James Bond on the big screen. Rolex was no longer just measuring time, it was measuring human courage. If Everest proved Rolex could conquer the highest places on Earth, the next challenge was the deepest. In 1960, the bathyscaphe Trieste made its historic descent nearly 11,000 meters into the Mariana Trench, the deepest known point in our oceans. Attached to the outside of the submarine was an experimental Rolex watch, the Deep Sea Special. At those depths, the pressure is immense enough to crush solid steel. Yet, when the vessel resurfaced, the Rolex was still ticking perfectly. This wasn't just a technical victory, it was a marketing masterpiece. Rolex had proven it could survive the most extreme environments on the planet. But Hans Wilsdorf understood something deeper. A watch wasn't just about endurance, it was also about status. He carefully cultivated Rolex's image by associating it with leaders, celebrities, and champions. Kings, presidents, athletes, scientists, and actors. Anyone who achieved greatness seemed to be photographed wearing a Rolex. It wasn't sold as a product, it was sold as proof that you had arrived. A Rolex didn't just tell time, it told the world who you were. Their advertising reinforced this message. Rolex rarely mentioned price. Instead, they told captivating stories of oceans crossed, records broken, and heights conquered. Every ad whispered the same powerful idea. If you want to be remembered, wear a Rolex. Hans Wilsdorf also knew the power of symbols. The five-pointed crown logo, introduced back in the 1920s, became one of the most recognized icons in the world. It wasn't just decoration. It was a crown for the wrist, a symbol of royalty, victory, and timeless power. When you saw that crown on a watch face, you weren't just looking at craftsmanship, you were looking at history. But the journey was not without its dangers. In the 1970s, the Swiss watch industry was rocked by what became known as the quartz crisis. Cheap, battery-powered quartz watches from Japan flooded the market. They were more accurate than mechanical watches and cost a fraction of the price. Many historic Swiss watch companies collapsed under the pressure. Rolex could have followed them into ruin. But instead of panicking, Rolex doubled down on what made it unique: luxury, durability, and legacy. They weren't just selling accuracy anymore, they were selling tradition, craftsmanship, and the feeling of owning something eternal. While others cut costs, Rolex raised its prestige. It positioned itself not against quartz watches, but far above them. The result? While many watchmakers disappeared, Rolex emerged stronger than ever. Hans Wilsdorf lived long enough to see his incredible dream become a reality. But he had no children to inherit the company. So, in an extraordinary final move, he left Rolex to the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation, a charitable trust. This ensured that Rolex would never be controlled by outsiders chasing profits. It would remain independent, relentlessly focused on excellence, and dedicated to giving back to the world. Hans Wilsdorf died in 1960. He had entered the world as an orphan with nothing and left it as the creator of the world's most famous watch. Today, Rolex is so much more than a watch. It's worn by world leaders, explorers, athletes, and icons. It's a reward for success, a treasured family heirloom, and a symbol of perfection. A Rolex doesn't just measure time, it embodies it. Just think about it. From the wrist of a soldier in the trenches, to the summit of Everest, to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, Rolex has been there. It is a brand that rose from tragedy, was built on an obsession with perfection, and carried forward by an unwavering vision. And it all began with a poor boy in Germany who lost everything but refused to stop dreaming. Hans Wilsdorf once said, "Rolex must be seen as the one and only, the best." More than a century later, his dream still ticks on, second by second, on millions of wrists around the world. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. We'll see you in the next one.